He was the king of the city, but he never forgot the mother who left him at a bus station. 20 years later, he returns to buy the old neighborhood, only to find a hidden room and a letter that proves his mother didn't leave him and die, as his uncle told him. She was forced out by his own business partner. Julian's charcoal gray limousine had moved slowly through the narrow streets of the village, its shiny surface reflecting the peeling paint and crumbling walls of the shacks he once called home. To the world, he was a genius who turned dreams into dollars, but to the people of Oakhaven, he was simply the boy who had escaped. The car came to a halt in the center of the village, kicking up a cloud of red dust. As Julian stepped out, his polished shoes crunching on the broken sidewalk, the villagers gathered at a distance, whispering about the boy who became a king. Walking toward him with a wide, forced smile was Uncle Silas. Silas was now the village head, a man who had grown comfortable ruling over this small pocket of poverty, while Julian sent monthly checks from abroad to maintain the community. "Julian, my favorite nephew!" Silas shouted, his voice booming with a fake warmth that didn't reach his eyes. Silas immediately reached out to shake Julian's hand, his gaze darting greedily toward Julian's gold watch and the expensive briefcase sitting in the back of the car. "It's been 20 long years since you left this place. We heard you were making lots of money, but look at you. You look like royalty." Julian looked around the square, noticing the leaking roofs and the children playing with a bent basketball hoop, just as he had done 2 decades ago. "The village looks worse than when I left, Silas," Julian said, his voice quiet and dangerous. Silas sighed dramatically, dabbing at his eyes with a handkerchief. "Times have been hard, Julian. Your mother's passing. It took the spirit out of Oakhaven. She was always so fickle, wanting a better life and then leaving us all behind." Julian's blood ran cold at the mention of his mother, Rose. He still remembered the day Silas told him she had disappeared, leaving a note saying she wanted a better life without the burden of a young son. He had spent 20 years trying to fill the hole in his heart with success, yet standing here, the pain felt as fresh as a new wound. He had come back to Oakhaven for one reason: to buy the land, demolish the shacks, and build a luxury resort that would finally erase the memories of his mother's betrayal. Or so he thought. Silas rubbed his hands together, already calculating his cut of the deal. "Well, let's not dwell on the past. You're here to sign the papers, aren't you? Let's turn this dust into gold." But as Julian looked at the old, familiar horizon, he felt a sudden, inexplicable urge to visit his childhood home one last time before the bulldozers arrived. He had no idea that inside that small, dusty shack, a secret was waiting for him, a secret that would prove his entire life had been built on a lie. Julian left Uncle Silas standing in the village square, his mind already drifting toward the edge of the woods. He didn't want the banquet. He didn't want the fake smiles or the greedy eyes of men who saw him as nothing more than a walking bank account. He needed to be alone. As he walked, his polished $1,000 leather shoes crunched on the broken sidewalk, a sound that felt like a betrayal of the boy who had once run these streets in sneakers, so worn he had to put cardboard inside to cover the holes. He followed the narrow, weed-choked path to the very end of the settlement. There it was. The tiny shack looked even smaller than he remembered, or perhaps Julian had simply grown used to the palaces he now inhabited. The white paint had turned a sickly, dirty gray, and the fence he used to climb was rotting into the earth. The roof was made of rusted tin with visible holes, the kind of roof that would let the rain in to soak everything a person owned. Julian stood at the gate, his heart pounding so hard he thought it might burst from his chest. He remembered the last time he was here, 20 years ago. He remembered coming home from school to find the house empty. He remembered Silas standing in the doorway with a sad face, holding a piece of paper. "Your mother is gone, Julian," Silas had said. "She left a note. She said she wanted a better life, a life where she wasn't burdened by a child and a leaking roof." For 2 decades, that truth had been the anchor of Julian's pain. It was the reason he had thrown himself into work, building an empire to prove he was worth staying for, yet always feeling an empty hole that no amount of billions could fill. He looked at the house next door. 2 bicycles, a blue one and a red one with faded plastic streamers, leaned against the porch. He saw a young boy, maybe 7 or 8 years old, peeking through the window with curious eyes that reminded him of the childhood he had lost to grief. Julian looked away, the weight of his perfect life feeling like a suit of armor that was 3 sizes too small. Julian reached into his pocket and pulled out an old, rusted key he had kept as a morbid souvenir. His hand shook as he fit it into the lock. Click. The door groaned open, releasing the scent of old wood, dust, and ghostly silence. Inside, the living room wasn't empty. It was a museum of his misery. He saw the same wobbly table where they had eaten dinner, the small brown couch where his mother, Rose, used to sew clothes for rich families until her hands were rough and cracked. He walked deeper into the shack, his feet quiet on the creaking floorboards. He stopped in the corner where his mother used to sit and pray every morning before she woke him with a smile, telling him, "Today is going to be a good day, my son. I can feel it." As Julian stood there, he noticed something odd. The sunlight hitting the floor at a low angle revealed a gap in the wood. One of the floorboards near the wall was slightly raised, as if it had been pried up and replaced many times. Julian knelt in the dust, ignoring the way it stained his expensive trousers. He used his car keys to pry the wood upward. Tucked into the dark dirt beneath the house was a rusted grey metal box. It was small, with a simple latch that clicked as Julian's trembling fingers forced it open. Inside, he didn't find money or jewels. He found a yellowed envelope with his name written in his mother's careful, slanted handwriting. "My dearest Julian." Julian's blood ran cold. He pulled out the pages, the paper crinkling in his grip. As his eyes scanned the first few lines, the world seemed to stop spinning. He realized in that moment that every prayer his mother had ever said for him had been a sacrifice, and that the man waiting for him in the village square was not his family, but his greatest enemy. Julian's hands shook as he gripped the yellowed pages of the letter, the paper crinkling under his touch, with a sound that seemed to fill the silent, dusty room. He looked at the familiar, slanted handwriting of his mother, Rose, and for a moment he could almost hear her voice whispering to him through the ink. The first sentence hit him like a physical blow, stealing the air from his lungs and making his heart hammer against his ribs. "My dearest Julian, if you are reading this, it means Silas finally let you return to this place, and I pray you have become the man I knew you could be." He blinked back tears, his vision blurring as he continued to read the words that would dismantle 20 years of lies. His mother had not left him because she wanted a better life, or because she was fickle, as Silas had claimed for 2 decades. She had been driven out, forced to choose between her own presence in his life and his very survival. The letter detailed a betrayal that made Julian's blood run cold with a focused, icy rage. Silas had discovered a small inheritance left behind by Julian's father, a modest sum intended to ensure Julian could go to university and escape the poverty of the village. To get his hands on that money, Silas had cornered Rose on a rainy night, much like the one she described in her letter. He told her that if she didn't disappear and leave the boy in his care, he would ensure Julian never finished school and remained a nobody in the streets forever. Silas had played on a mother's deepest fear, the fear that her presence would hold her child back from greatness. Rose had sacrificed everything, including the love of her only son, to ensure he had a path to the success he now enjoyed. I lived in the cellar of the house next door for months, Julian. The letter continued, each word feeling like a knife stabbing into his chest. I watched you through the window as you cried for me, and it took every ounce of my strength not to run to you and hold you. Julian let out a choked sob, his whole body shaking as he pictured his young self, alone and grieving, while his mother was only a few yards away, trapped in her own nightmare. She wrote about how Silas had eventually moved her to a nearby town, forcing her to live as a ghost under a different name so that no one would ever question the story of her death. Silas had even built a fake grave, a monument to a lie that he used to keep Julian grateful and subservient for years. As he read on, Julian realized that the checks he had been sending to Silas every month to maintain the village had never reached the people who needed them. While Julian lived in luxury, wearing suits that cost a fortune, and closing multi-million-dollar deals, his mother had been working 3 jobs just to buy bread. She described her rough, cracked hands and the way she had to skip her own meals so she could save pennies to stay near enough to hear news of his success. She had been a beggar in her own life so that he could be a king in his. Julian felt a surge of shame that he had believed the lies for so long, that he had never questioned the closed coffin or the suddenness of her departure. He looked out the dirty window of the shack and saw Silas in the distance, still laughing with the village elders, acting like a man of honor. Julian's hands curled into tight fists. He was no longer the boy with cardboards in his shoes, and he was no longer the billionaire looking to demolish his past. He was a son who had found his mother's truth, and he was a man who now had a new mission. The money he had built was no longer just for business. It was going to be the weapon he used to bring Silas to justice. He carefully folded the letter and placed it back into the metal box, his eyes hard and cold like a winter storm. The test had truly begun, and he would not stop until he found the woman who had sacrificed her life for his. He stood up, his polished shoes no longer feeling like a betrayal, but like the foundation of the man who was about to dismantle an empire of lies. Julian stepped out of the shadow of his childhood shack, the rusted metal box tucked firmly under his arm. To anyone watching from the village square, he was still the cold, calculated billionaire returning to sign a contract. But inside, Julian felt his heart breaking into a million pieces. He looked toward the village center, where Uncle Silas was laughing with a group of elders, and for the first time, Julian didn't see a protector. He saw a monster. Julian returned to the back of his charcoal gray limousine and pulled out his private satellite phone, a device only a few special people had the number for. "Marcus," he said, his voice quiet and dangerous, "I need an elite team on the ground in Oak Haven immediately. I want a quiet trace on every woman named Rose Cole in the province. Don't look for death records. Look for a ghost. Look for someone who has been living without a paper trail for 20 years. Before meeting Silas for the planned banquet, Julian made one more stop. He walked to the edge of the village cemetery, a place of ghostly silence and long shadows. He stood before a small, neglected headstone that simply read, Rose. There were no dates of birth or death. Silas had brought him here 10 years ago, claiming it was the final resting place of the mother who wanted a better life. Julian knelt in the dirt, his $5,000 suit contrasting with the dry earth. He touched the cold granite and felt a surge of icy rage. This wasn't a grave. It was a monument to a lie. As he left the cemetery, Julian noticed an old woman, Mrs. Gable, hanging laundry outside a shack that looked ready to collapse. Her hands were rough and cracked from years of work, similar to the descriptions in his mother's letter. When their eyes met, Mrs. Gable's face went white as paper, and she quickly looked away. Julian approached her gently. "Mrs. Gable, it's Julian. I remember the cookies you used to bake for me." The woman trembled, her eyes darting towards Silas's house in the distance. "You shouldn't be here, Julian. Silas has ears everywhere. He doesn't like people talking about the past." Julian reached out and took her hand. "I have enough money to buy this entire province, Mrs. Gable. My security team is already surrounding this village. You are safe now. I'm not here to build a resort. I'm here for the truth." Mrs. Gable's voice dropped to a terrified whisper. "Your mother, she didn't want to go. Silas had men in dark suits take her away in the middle of a rainy night. He told us she was sick in the head and that he was sending her to a facility for her own good. But we all knew. He just wanted that money your father left." Julian's blood ran cold. He realized that for 20 years, the monthly maintenance stipends he had been sending Silas to improve the village had never reached the people. He quickly accessed his private banking app and ran a high-level audit on the village accounts. His eyes widened in shock as he saw the truth. Millions of dollars had been siphoned into secret offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands. The same pattern of greed he had seen in the most ruthless business monsters. Silas hadn't just stolen a mother from her son. He had intentionally kept Oakhaven in systemic poverty to ensure the villagers remained grateful and subservient. Julian looked at the children playing with the bent basketball hoop and felt a hole in his perfect life being replaced by a focused, burning purpose. He wasn't just a billionaire anymore. He was a son with the proof and the power to dismantle an empire of lies. The test was over, and the reckoning was about to begin. The moon hung over Oakhaven like a cold silver coin, but inside Uncle Silas's house, the air was thick with the smell of roasted meat and expensive wine. Silas had spent the last few hours transforming his living room into a palace of hypocrisy. While the rest of the village huddled in shacks with leaking roofs, Silas sat at a long mahogany table, surrounded by the finest comforts that Julian's diverted maintenance checks could buy. Julian sat at the head of the table, his face a mask of calm, though inside he felt his blood running cold with every laugh that erupted from Silas's throat. Across from him, Silas was cutting into a thick, juicy steak, his eyes gleaming with the same cold greed Julian had read about in his mother's letter. "Eat, Julian, eat!" Silas boomed, gesturing to the spread of food that could have fed 10 village families for a month. "In Oakhaven, we may be poor, but we know how to treat a king." Just then, a young woman named Eleanor entered the room. She was a server Silas had hired from the village for the night. She was thin, her hands rough and cracked from years of labor, and her eyes were fixed on the floor as she moved to refill the wine glasses. As she reached Silas, her hand trembled slightly, and a single drop of red wine landed on Silas's white tablecloth. Silas's face changed instantly. The fake warmth vanished, replaced by a sneer of pure disgust. "You clumsy girl!" he hissed, grabbing Elena's wrist. "Do you have any idea what this cloth cost? You're as worthless as the dirt you walk on." Elena whispered a terrified apology, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs. Julian watched the interaction, his grip tightening on his silver fork. He saw in Elena the same vulnerability his mother must have felt when Silas drove her into the rain 20 years ago. He realized that Silas didn't just want Julian's money. He enjoyed the power of making people feel small. "Leave her alone, Silas," Julian said, his voice quiet but carrying a weight that silenced the room. Silas blinked, his forced smile returning like a flickering light bulb. "Ah, Julian, you always were too soft-hearted, just like your mother, Rose." Silas leaned back, taking a long sip of wine. "She was a weak-willed woman, you know. Always crying, always complaining about the struggle. She didn't have the stomach for the life your father wanted for you. She was fickle, Julian. She left you because she wanted a simpler life without the burden of a child. Julian's heart broke into a million pieces, hearing Silas insult the woman who had sacrificed her entire existence to keep him safe. He looked at Silas and saw a monster who had been playing God with his family's lives for 2 decades. Silas, sensing no reaction from Julian, reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a thick document. He slid it across the table, his eyes darting greedily toward Julian's expensive watch. "Speaking of your father's legacy, here is the contract for the resort development. Sign this tonight and we can start the demolition tomorrow. We'll tear down those old eyesores, including your mother's shack, and finally make some real money." Julian looked down at the contract. It was the trap he had been waiting for. He didn't pick up the pen. Instead, he looked Silas directly in the eye. "Demolishing the past is easy, Silas, but sometimes the past has a way of coming back to life when you least expect it." Silas laughed, a cold, satisfied sound, unaware that Julian's security team had just sent a GPS ping to his phone. They had found a woman selling baskets in a town 30 miles away, a woman with a small beauty mark near her left ear. The feast was over, and the hunt for the truth had truly begun. Julian's charcoal-gray limousine sped through the dark roads leading away from Oakhaven, leaving the palace of hypocrisy and Silas's greedy eyes far behind. His mind was a storm of images from the letter: a young mother watching her son through a cellar window, a woman forced to become a ghost to ensure her child had a future. Every mile the car traveled felt like it was undoing 20 years of lies. The GPS ping from his security team led Julian to a dusty, forgotten town 30 miles away. As the sun began to rise, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, Julian stepped out of his car near a small, crowded marketplace. The contrast was devastating. Julian stood there in his $5,000 suit and polished shoes, while around him people moved with the particular tiredness of those who had worked hard for very little. He walked toward the edge of the market, where the vendors who couldn't afford stalls sat on the ground. His heart hammered against his ribs, a painful pounding that made it hard to breathe. Then he saw her. An old woman sat on a thin, tattered mat by the side of the road. In front of her was a small pile of hand-woven baskets. She looked much older than her 60 years. The streets have a way of taking the softness out of a face and replacing it with something harder and more exhausted. She was severely thin, and her faded clothes hung loose on her fragile frame. Julian stopped several feet away, hiding behind a wooden pillar. He watched her work. Her fingers moved with a rhythmic, practiced grace, but as she reached for more straw, Julian saw her hands. They were rough and cracked, the knuckles swollen and the skin thick from decades of labor that never stopped. These were the hands that had sewed clothes for rich families to pay his school fees while he was a boy. As he watched, a stray, mangy dog approached her, its ribs showing through its fur. The woman paused her weaving and reached into a small plastic bag. She pulled out a single dry piece of bread, likely her only meal for the day. With a soft, genuine smile, she broke the bread in half and offered it to the animal. "Eat, little one," she whispered, her voice a gentle melody that Julian recognized from his earliest memories. "Mama's here. You don't have to be hungry today." Julian felt a surge of shame mixed with icy rage towards Silas. While Julian had been closing multi-million-dollar deals and living in a mansion that looked like a museum, his mother had been a beggar in her own life, just to stay close enough to hear news of him. She had been sacrificing everything, while he believed the lie that she didn't want him. He stepped out from the shadows, his eyes blurred by tears he hadn't shed in 20 years. He noticed a small beauty mark near her left ear. exactly as the security report had described. This wasn't a ghost, and she wasn't dead. She was a woman with a heart of gold who had been discarded by greed, but remained unbroken. The woman looked up, noticing the rich man in the expensive suit standing over her. She didn't look at him with envy or anger, only with tired, quiet eyes. She began to pull her mat back, thinking she was in his way. "I'm sorry, sir," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "I'll move my things. I didn't mean to block your path." Julian couldn't find his voice. He looked at her worn-out sneakers and the way she folded herself small to take up as little space as possible. He realized that the hole in his perfect life was finally about to be filled, but first he had to tell the woman who had become a ghost that her son had finally come home. Julian stood at the edge of the dusty marketplace, his breath coming in shallow, jagged gasps. For 20 years, he had lived with a hole in his perfect life, a void created by the belief that he wasn't enough to make his mother stay. Now, seeing her sitting on a tattered mat just 30 feet away, that void was being filled with a mixture of overwhelming love and a blood-running cold fury directed at Uncle Silas. The woman he was watching didn't look like the vibrant Rose Cole from his childhood memories. The streets had been cruel to her. She looked severely thin, her frame so fragile it seemed as though a strong wind might sweep her away. Her clothes were faded and patched, and her feet were tucked into worn-out sneakers that had seen far too many miles. But as she leaned over to offer a stray dog the last of her dry bread, Julian saw the heart of gold that no amount of poverty could tarnish. "Today is going to be a good day, my son. I can feel it." Those words, which she used to whisper to him every morning in their tiny shack, echoed in his mind. Julian realized with a surge of shame that while he had been sleeping on silk sheets and closing billion-dollar deals, the woman who made his success possible had been surviving on scraps. She had become a ghost to protect him, a beggar in her own life just to ensure his future was bright. Julian finally stepped out from behind the wall. Julian felt a lump form in his throat, so large he could barely speak. He didn't care about his $5,000 suit or the eyes of the curious onlookers. He dropped to his knees in the red dirt directly in front of her. "I'm not an important person, Mama," he whispered, his voice cracking with the weight of 2 decades of suppressed tears. "I'm just a boy who has been lost for a very long time." Rose froze. Her hands, still clutching a half-finished basket, began to tremble violently. She slowly lifted her head, her tired, quiet eyes meeting his. At first, there was only confusion. She saw an expensive suit, a gold watch, and a face of a powerful man. But as she looked closer, she saw the small beauty mark near his ear that mirrored her own. She saw the green eyes of the husband she had lost, and the soul of the little boy she had watched through a cellar window so many years ago. "Julian," she breathed, the word barely a whisper. "It's me, Mama. I found the box. I found the letter," Julian said, tears finally streaming down his face. The baskets fell from her hands, scattering across the dirt. Rose let out a choked, broken sob and reached out with her rough hands to touch his face, as if checking to see if he was made of flesh and bone, or just another cruel dream. "My son, my beautiful boy," she wailed, pulling him into her chest. Her frame felt fragile as glass, but her grip was filled with a strength that only a mother can possess. Julian held her tight, burying his face in her shoulder, ignoring the scent of dust and the heat of the sun. In that moment, the billionaire tech giant disappeared. He was just Julian again. "You're never sleeping on this mat again, Mama," Julian whispered fiercely into her hair. "You gave up your life so I could have mine. Now I'm going to use everything I have to make sure you never have to be a ghost again. And Silas Silas is going to learn that some secrets don't stay buried forever. He helped her stand, his arm wrapped firmly around her narrow shoulders to support her. As he led her toward the waiting limousine, the villagers watched in stunned silence. They didn't know who the woman was, but they could see that the king had finally found his queen. The hunt for the truth was over. The season of reckoning had begun. Julian returned to Oakhaven later that afternoon, his mind a whirlpool of conflicting emotions. Finding his mother alive had filled the empty hole in his chest, but it had also replaced his grief with a cold, calculated fire. He had left Rose in the safety of a high-end hotel in the city, guarded by his most trusted security detail. Now he needed to return to the ruins of his past to finish what Silas had started 20 years ago. As the limousine crossed the village threshold, Julian noticed an immediate shift in the atmosphere. The children who had been playing in the dirt earlier were whisked away into shacks by their mothers as his car passed. The men leaning against the rusted fences didn't offer the curious nods they had given him that morning. Instead, they looked at him with cold judgment, their eyes narrow and full of suspicion. Julian stepped out of the car in the village square, and for the first time, he felt like a stranger in his own home. In the center of the square, Uncle Silas stood on a makeshift wooden platform, surrounded by a crowd of nearly 50 villagers. Silas was mid-speech, his voice booming with a fake righteousness that made Julian's blood run cold. "He comes back with his polished shoes and his gold watch," Silas shouted, pointing a dramatic finger toward Julian. "He calls himself a son of Oakhaven, but he doesn't see people. He sees profit. He wants to tear down your homes, the roofs your fathers built, just to build a playground for the rich. He is a heartless tycoon who has forgotten the dirt he came from." A murmur of anger rippled through the crowd. An old man Julian remembered as Mr. Gable, the husband of the woman who had earlier whispered the truth to him, stepped forward. His face was twisted with a mixture of fear and betrayal. "Is it true, Julian? Are you going to throw us into the street like trash?" Julian opened his mouth to speak, to tell them that he was building a hospital and safe housing, but Silas was faster. "Don't let him lie to you with his fancy words. I've seen the contracts. He thinks we are eyesores that need to be demolished." Julian realized with a painful pounding in his heart that Silas had systematically poisoned the minds of the people he intended to help. Silas was acting as the savior of the village, while he continued to siphon the very funds Julian had sent to protect them. Just then, a commotion broke out near the village tavern. Eleanor, the young server who had been kind to Julian during the previous night's feast, was being pushed by two of Silas's thugs. They were shouting at her, calling her a traitor and a spy for the billionaire. "You took his tips. You smiled at the man who wants to destroy us," one of the thugs hissed, knocking a tray of glasses from her hands. The glass shattered on the pavement, a sound that seemed to echo the breaking of Julian's own hope for a peaceful resolution. Eleanor didn't shout back. She simply knelt in the dirt to pick up the shards, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs. Julian moved toward her, his instinct to protect taking over, but Silas's voice cut through the air again. "Look at him. He runs to his servant, the only one he thinks he can buy." Julian stopped. He looked at the faces of the villagers, people he had spent 20 years wanting to save. He saw their anger, but underneath it, he saw the systemic poverty and fear that Silas had cultivated like a dark garden. He realized that as long as he stood before them as a king, they would only see him through the lens of Silas's lies. He needed to strip away the suit, the car, and the billions. He needed to know who in this village still held the heart of gold his mother had described in her letter. He needed to see Oakhaven not as a billionaire, but as the boy with cardboard in his shoes. "The test has moved to a new stage," Julian whispered to himself. He turned his back on the shouting crowd and walked to his limousine, instructing his driver to take him to a nearby town. He didn't need a resort, and he didn't need a contract. He needed a disguise. He would return to Oakhaven one more time, but this time he would arrive with nothing, to see who would offer a hand to a nobody and who would spit on a man when he was down. The reckoning was coming, but first the truth had to be tested in the dirt. Julian stood in the darkness of his old childhood shack, the very place where he had discovered the truth just days ago. He looked at the $5,000 suit he had been wearing, a symbol of the king he had become. Slowly, he began to peel it off. He replaced the fine silk and wool with a pair of dirt-stained jeans and a faded plaid shirt with holes at both elbows, clothes he had acquired from a local thrift shop to hide his identity. He even went as far as to rub a small amount of real soil under his fingernails and skip his morning shave. For the final touch, he took a pair of sneakers so worn at the sole that he had to fold a piece of cardboard inside the left one to cover a hole. He looked in the cracked mirror of the shack. The billionaire was gone. Standing there was a man who looked like he hadn't showered in days. A man who looked wrong and smelled wrong. He was no longer the tycoon Silas feared. He was now the person who arrives with nothing. Julian took a deep breath, checked the hidden recording device tucked into his collar, and stepped out into the village night. He walked toward the village tavern, the same place where Silas was currently celebrating with the village elders, drinking wine bought with Julian's stolen maintenance money. As Julian pushed open the heavy wooden door, the laughter and buzzing excitement inside died down instantly. The smell of someone who had been living on the streets arrived before he did, and the small group of people gathered near the entrance immediately stepped back, wrinkling their noses and turning their faces away. "Julian?" Silas's voice boomed from the head of a long table, but it wasn't the warm, greedy shout of the morning. It was sharp and suspicious. "What is the meaning of this? Why are you dressed like a beggar?" Julian walked to the center of the room, his shoulders slumped and his voice shaking with a fake desperation that he had practiced for hours. "It's over, Silas," Julian whispered, loud enough for the whole tavern to hear. "The board of directors, they found out about the losses. The banks have seized everything. My tech empire has crashed. My accounts are frozen. My cars, my penthouse, it's all gone. I have nothing left but the clothes on my back and this old shack." The silence that followed was cold and quiet, moving through the room like a winter breeze. Silas stood up slowly, his face transforming from a mask of fake warmth to a sneer of pure, cold greed. He walked toward Julian, his polished shoes clicking on the floor. He didn't offer a hand of comfort or a chair to sit in. Instead, he looked at Julian's worn-out sneakers with contempt. "Bankrupt?" Silas hissed, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "You mean you're a nobody again? You came back here promising millions, and now you're just another mouth to feed? Another street rat looking for a handout?" "I'm your family, Silas," Julian pleaded, testing the limits of the man's cruelty. "I need a place to stay, just for a few weeks until I get back on my feet. I thought Oakhaven was my home." Silas laughed, a cold, happy laugh that held no sadness at all. "Family? You were only family when you were signing checks, Julian. You're as fickle and weak-willed as your mother was. Oakhaven is a place for the successful, not for losers who can't manage their own money. We don't serve your kind here. Get out of my sight before I call the police for trespassing on village property." The villagers, who had only hours ago been nodding to him, now looked at their plates. Some whispered about the heartless tycoon who had finally gotten what he deserved. They chose the other side of the road, just like the people in the stories Julian's mother used to tell him about the true heart of the sheep. But then, a small tray was set down on the table next to him. It was Eleanor, the young server with rough and cracked hands, who had been bullied by Silas the night before. She didn't look at his dirty clothes or his messy hair. She looked into his eyes with genuine concern. She pushed a bowl of hot vegetable soup and a thick slice of bread toward him. "Eat, sir," she whispered, her voice a gentle melody in the hostel room. "I know what it's like to have the world turn its back on you. My mother always said that money comes and goes, but character stays forever. This one is on me. You don't have to be alone tonight." Julian felt a lump form in his throat. In a room full of people he had known his whole life, the only person to offer him mercy was the one who had the least to give. He looked at Silas, who was already busy telling the elders how he would demolish the shack tomorrow to get rid of the eyesore. Julian touched the recording device on his collar and smiled a dangerous, quiet smile. The test was complete. He had found the heart of gold in the dirt, and he had captured the monster in his own words. The reckoning was no longer a plan. It was a certainty. The morning sun rose over Oakhaven, painting the dusty streets in shades of orange and gold, but it brought no warmth to the hearts of the villagers. A mandatory town hall meeting had been called at the village square, and the air was thick with a quiet, heavy tension. Uncle Silas stood on a makeshift wooden platform in the center of the square, wearing a pristine white shirt and a self-satisfied smirk that made Julian's blood run cold. Silas raised his hands for silence, acting like a dignified savior of the people. "My dear friends," he boomed, his voice echoing against the peeling paint of the nearby shacks. "Yesterday, we saw the true face of the boy we once called a king. Julian Cole returned to us with nothing but lies and a heartless plan to demolish our history. But as you saw last night, his empire has crumbled. He is a bankrupt loser who came crawling back to us for a handout." A murmur of shock and anger moved through the crowd. "He wanted to make us homeless," a man shouted from the back. Silas nodded solemnly, dabbing at a fake tear with his silk handkerchief. "He is as fickle and weak as his mother was. But do not fear, I have the papers right here to protect Oakhaven from his greed." Just then, the crowd parted. Julian walked toward the platform, still dressed in the torn, dirt-stained clothes of a nobody. His hair was messy, and his shoulders were slumped, but in his hand he carried the rusted grey metal box he had found beneath the floorboards. Silas erupted in a cold, happy laugh that sounded more like a bark. "Look at him. The billionaire has returned to beg in front of the whole town. Guards, remove this street rat before he stains the square with his presence." Julian didn't stop. He climbed the steps of the platform, his worn-out sneakers crunching on the wood. He stood directly in front of Silas, his eyes hard and cold like a winter storm. "I'm not here for a handout, Silas," Julian said, his voice quiet but carrying a weight that silenced the entire square. "I'm here to give you a choice. You can admit to what you did 20 years ago, or I can let the village hear it from your own mouth." Silas sneered, leaning close so only Julian could hear. "You're a nobody now, Julian. No one believes a beggar over the head of the village. Your mother died a fickle ghost, and you'll die a broke one." Julian pulled his high-tech phone from his pocket, the only item that betrayed his true wealth. With a few quick taps, he connected it to the village's old speaker system, which Silas had used for his palace of hypocrisy. Suddenly, a voice thundered through the square. It was Silas's voice, recorded only hours ago in the tavern. "Family? You were only family when you were signing checks, Julian. I only tolerated you for the billions. I drove that woman into the rain 20 years ago because she was an eyesore to my plans. I stole the inheritance and I'd do it again." The silence that followed was cold and quiet, stretching across the square like a shadow. Silas's face went white as a sheet, his mouth dropping open in shock as he looked at the villagers who had trusted him for decades. The recording continued, playing the sound of Silas mocking Rose's cracked hands and bragging about the Cayman accounts where he had hidden Julian's money. Julian stood tall, the disguise of the beggar falling away as his natural authority returned. "You didn't just steal my money, Silas," Julian said, his voice echoing through the speakers. "You stole a mother from her son. You stole 20 years of peace from this village. The test is over, and the monster has finally been unmasked in the light of day." Silas staggered back, realizing that the man standing before him wasn't a bankrupt loser. He was a son who had finally brought the truth home. The silence that followed the recording was unlike anything the village of Oakhaven had ever experienced. It was a cold and quiet stillness that seemed to freeze the very air in the square. The villagers, who had only moments ago been nodding in agreement with Silas, now looked at him with eyes full of shock and horror. The man they had called their leader, their protector, had just been unmasked by his own voice as a monster who had traded a mother's life for a few bags of gold. Uncle Silas stood on the wooden platform, his legs shaking so violently that he had to grip the railing to stay upright. His face, once flushed with the fake warmth of victory, was now the color of ash. He looked at Julian, who was still standing in his torn, dirt-stained clothes, and his mouth moved, but no sound came out. The disguise of the beggar no longer hid the billionaire. It highlighted the man of character Julian had become. "You're a liar!" a voice shouted from the crowd. It was Mr. Gable, his face twisted with the guilt of having believed Silas for so long. "You told us she left him. You told us she was fickle." Soon, the square erupted into a roar of indignation. The villagers felt the surge of shame that comes when a community realizes they have been complicit in a tragedy. Julian raised his hand, and the crowd went silent again. He didn't look at the villagers. He looked directly at Silas. 20 years ago, you drove a woman into the rain because you wanted to play God with her son's future. You thought that because she was poor, she was invisible. You thought that by burying a letter under a floorboard, you could bury the truth. Julian's voice thundered through the speaker system, echoing against the peeling paint of the shacks. "But you forgot one thing, Silas. A mother's love is a heart of gold that never stops shining, even in the darkest cellar." Just then, a low hum vibrated through the square. The crowd parted as a charcoal-grey limousine, identical to the one Julian had arrived in, moved slowly through the mud. It came to a halt right at the foot of the platform. The door was opened by a man in a crisp suit, Julian's head of security, but every eye was fixed on the woman who stepped out. The villagers gasped, some women buried their faces in their hands, and others began to sob. Standing there, dressed in a gown of soft blue silk, with a strand of pearls around her neck, was Rose Cole. She looked dignified and beautiful, a far cry from the woman with cracked hands Julian had found in the marketplace only yesterday. Though her frame was still fragile as glass, she walked with her head held high. She looked up at Silas, who scrambled backward on the platform, nearly falling off the edge. "Rose," he whispered, his voice cracking with a painful pounding of terror. It can't be. You're a ghost." Rose stepped up the stairs of the platform, her movements unhurried. She stood before the man who had stolen 2 decades of her life. "I am not a ghost, Silas," she said, her voice a gentle melody that carried a new, unshakable strength. "I am the mother you tried to erase, and today I am coming home to my son." She turned to Julian, and the hardness in his eyes melted instantly. He reached out and took her hand, the same hand that had sewed clothes for Scraps to ensure he had a future. In that moment, the hole in his perfect life was filled completely. Julian turned back to the crowd, his natural authority returning. I didn't come back to Oakhaven to build a resort for the rich. I didn't come to demolish your history." He pulled a new set of documents from the rusted metal box. "I came to restore what was stolen. Silas has siphoned millions into Cayman accounts while you suffered. Today those accounts are frozen. That money is coming back to this village." He paused, looking at the stunned faces of the people he grew up with. "We are not building a resort. We are building the Rose Cole Memorial Hospital and a new housing cooperative. Oakhaven will no longer be a monument to systemic poverty. It will be a place of hope." As the sounds of sirens filled the air and the local police arrived to place Silas in handcuffs, the villagers didn't cheer. They simply watched in a quiet, heavy reverence. They watched as the billionaire son and his dead mother stood together on the platform, two people who had survived the monster of greed and returned with a legacy of truth. The season of reckoning was over. The season of healing had finally begun. 3 months had passed since the morning the silence of Oakhaven was broken by the sound of truth. The red dust that once choked the streets of Julian's childhood was now settled beneath freshly paved roads, and the ghostly silence of the village had been replaced by the rhythmic thumping of hammers and the cheerful calling of neighbors. Oakhaven was no longer a monument to systemic poverty. It was a sanctuary of hope. Julian stood on the porch of his childhood home. The shack was no longer a rotting ruin with a rusted tin roof. He had refused to demolish it, choosing instead to restore it with the finest materials money could buy. The walls were a warm, sturdy cedar, and the new roof was made of vibrant red tiles, a symbol of the red roof his mother, Rose, had always dreamed of in the stories she told him when he was a boy. Inside, the floorboards were polished and level, and the gap where the rusted metal box had once hidden was now a seamless part of a beautiful mahogany floor. Julian turned as the screen door creaked open. Rose stepped out, wearing a simple but elegant dress of soft cream silk. Her cracked hands had been treated by the best specialists in the country, and while the scars of 20 years of labor remained, her fingers no longer shook with the cold. She held 2 steaming mugs of tea, prepared exactly the way they used to have them, weak with a touch of honey. "The hospital is nearly finished, Julian," Rose said, her voice a gentle melody that carried across the quiet morning air. She looked toward the center of the village, where the Rose Cole Memorial Hospital now stood. It was a state-of-the-art facility, ensuring that no mother in Oakhaven would ever have to choose between her medicine and her child's school shoes again. Julian smiled, taking the mug. "It's the best investment I've ever made, Mama. For years I thought success was about the numbers in my bank account. I thought the hole in my perfect life could be filled with more companies and more power. But standing here with you, I realize that billions are only useful when they are used to protect the people we love." Later that afternoon, a young woman walked up the path to the house. It was Elena. She was no longer a server in a stained uniform, looking at the floor in fear. She was dressed in a professional suit, her head held high. Julian had appointed her as the manager of the Oakhaven Village Cooperative. He had seen her heart of gold when she offered a bowl of soup to a bankrupt beggar, and he knew that her integrity was the foundation the new village needed. "The first shipment of supplies for the school has arrived, Mr. Cole," Elena said with a bright, genuine smile. "Call me Julian, Elena," he replied. "In this village, we are all family now." As the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold, Julian walked back into the house and sat at the old kitchen table. He reached into his briefcase and pulled out the rusted gray metal box. He looked at the yellowed envelope and the 4 pages of slanted handwriting that had saved his life. He didn't need to read them anymore. The words were written on his heart. He placed his mother's old photograph back inside the box, the one of her standing by the window, 7 months pregnant and full of bravery. Beside it, he placed a new photograph, a picture of him and Rose standing together on the day Silas was led away in handcuffs. The monster was gone, facing a long sentence for embezzlement and fraud, and the king had finally brought his queen home. Julian closed the latch of the metal box with a firm, satisfying click. He realized that the test he had set for the village had actually been a test for himself. He had learned that money comes and goes, but character stays forever. He stood up and walked to the porch to join his mother. As they watched the stars begin to sparkle like diamonds over a thriving Oak Haven, Julian felt a peace he hadn't known in 20 years. The truth had set them both free, and the legacy of the dead mother was now a living promise of a brighter future. The story of the billionaire who returned to his ruins was over, but the story of the son who found his heart had just begun. Julian's journey reminds us that the most expensive suit in the world cannot hide a broken heart, and the truth, no matter how deep it is buried, will always find its way to the light. The real lesson here is that money comes and goes, but the character we show when we have nothing is what truly defines us. In my opinion, the most beautiful part of this story wasn't just the justice Julian found, but his willingness to trade his pride for the truth. It takes a truly successful man to walk back into the dirt of his past and admit that his billions felt empty without the mother who sacrificed her very identity to keep him safe. Now I want to hear from you. Who was your favorite character in this story? Was it Rose, for her silent, unbreakable strength? Was it Julian, for having the courage to see past the lies? Or perhaps Elena, the server who proved that a heart of gold is the greatest wealth of all? If this story moved you, please like, share and subscribe to our channel so you never miss a journey of justice. Don't forget to tell us in the comments, "This is Mr. Hope, and I am so grateful you shared this time with me." I will see you in the next story.